Roman Stengelin from the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology.
Okay, here we go. All right, I would like to start with a little virtual lab tour. So this is one of the most commonly approached closets at our child lab at MPI EFA in Leipzig. It's the one with what we call Lola Puppen. Let's have a quick look inside. And there are creepy shelves full of puppets. So we, at least in Leipzig, we seem quite obsessed about them. And for those who do not share this obsession, I brought one with me. So this one is Alex. So Alex is definitely one of the most appreciated and experienced colleagues that we have in Leipzig. So Alex has vast experience in testing children's cooperation, children's theory of mind, their normativity, prosociality, deception, social learning. Alex can do it all. But how do children actually perceive Alex and their lookalikes? So this will be about my attempts testing puppetry to simulate peer interactions in social cognition or social development research. I will start with some background to the topic and some shared logic behind the studies to follow. It's 2 studies, and I will close with some constraints on generality and discuss some recommendations for using Alex and their friends in the future. So a key challenge of social development research is to study children in meaningful social settings, the ones that matter for child development, and these are most notably children's interactions with their peers and children's interactions with adults. So these together form the 2 social worlds of childhoods. And some aspects might better be studied with peers, some aspects might better be studied with adults, some might only be studied with peers. This is because we assume that they're not the same, they differ. Indeed, so peer interactions are typically less hierarchical than adult-child interactions, and indeed we also find children's sensitivity to partners' age across several domains of social cognition. At the same time, we, as developmental psychologists, often tend to prefer testing children with adult partners. Why so? Well, we run into difficulties standardizing peer research. It's very difficult to test or to standardize the behavior of peer confederates. And we also run into power issues because we can't test all children as target participants. Okay, what to do about this? A common approach that I've encountered in developmental science is to use puppets animated by adults as stand-ins for peers. This is what I define puppetry here. And this application of puppetry follows a certain logic. So we expect different displays of social cognition based on whether children engage with peers or with adults. We are interested in peer interactions, but we don't want to or we can't test them. So we use puppets animated by adults instead. Let's call this the puppet as child hypothesis. This is, of course, a hypothesis that needs to be tested. It might be wrong, right? So children might also perceive puppets as the adult enacting them. Let's call this the puppet as adult hypothesis. And as a final alternative, children might also perceive puppets as neither peers nor adults, but as distinct entities. So in 2 studies, we sought to pit these hypotheses against each other. So in line with the puppet as child hypothesis, we treated children's social cognition with peers and with puppets as one condition, distinct from the adult condition. And please remember, this is the kind of logic that we apply when we use puppetry in this application. Otherwise, there's no meaning of using puppets in this application. We treated the puppet condition and the adult condition as one condition distinct from the peer condition to model the puppet as adult hypothesis, and modeled children's social cognition with puppets as distinct from the other 2 to model the puppet as puppet hypothesis. And in a final kind of null model, we also assumed that it basically doesn't make a difference whether we use puppets, adults, or children. Okay, let's go to the participants. As is true for any child development research area, almost all the research using puppetry here is conducted with urban middle-class families from the global north. This is a very recent icon photo from the local news in Leipzig about Leipzig kindergartens. So I think it's very obvious that these children frequently experience and often even own puppets or dolls or crafted artifacts, so they engage with them quite easily. And so in our child lab in Leipzig, luckily, we could conveniently test children from just this prototypical context in which puppetry research is typically conducted. I just want to highlight here quickly that these children may have certain attitudes and exposure to puppets. Okay, so we tested 72 children in an over-imitation task, and we tested 144 children in tasks on normativity, prosociality, and theory of mind. Let's start with the first study on over-imitation. Just to give you some background here, so over-imitation defined as deliberate copying of actions which are causally irrelevant for achieving instrumental goals. So we chose this phenomenon because research has shown children show high sensitivity to their partner's characteristics in over-imitation tasks. So they seem to copy adults more than peers, although there's also one study finding a reverse pattern. And puppets have also already been applied in over-imitation research as well. So we were interested in children's life interactions, but we were not allowed to invite dyads of peers to the lab due to health guidelines in 2021. So to simulate the life interactions and to standardize the situation as good as possible, we designed a mock Skype call paradigm in which children engaged with either another child, an adult, or a puppet. And children went through the following phases. So in an initial introduction phase, we established reciprocal exchange between the child and their partner. And in a test phase, then children had the chance to retrieve stickers from transparent containers, and we looked at whether they would copy the causally irrelevant actions that their partner had modeled prior. And we looked at, this is basically our index of over-imitation. Before going to the results, just a few words on the data analysis. This is a bit complicated. So we performed a 6-fold cross-validation, and I really don't want to bother you too much with statistics here, but the idea is to simulate samples from the actual data, split this data into bins, fit the model to one data bin, and predict the remaining data using this model. And for inference, we looked at which of the hypotheses that I already talked about best predicted the remaining data. And it's important to note that this deviates a little from our pre-registration as it emerged during peer review only, but the main conclusions are similar to the ones that we initially pre-registered. So this indicates a robust pattern of results. And we found that children over-imitated adults, children, and puppets. At the same time, children seem to over-imitate peers more than puppets. They also seem to over-imitate adults more than puppets. And there was only subtle variation across the adult and the child condition. And let's look at the predictive accuracies of the hypothesis. On the x-axis here, you will see the proportion of correct predictions made by each model or hypothesis. And on the y-axis, the different hypotheses. This is how the data looks like. So we find that the puppet as puppet hypothesis outperforms all the remaining hypotheses and models. So children do over-imitate puppets. This is a small effect size, but they do so less than peers and adults. Okay, study 2 was a registered report. So we wanted to look at children's normativity, prosociality, and theory of mind with puppets. And since one of the reviewers recommended to also add another task on children's mind descriptions, we also did that. So in a mind description phase, we confronted children with 3 different photographs of a puppet, of a peer, and of an adult. And we asked them 4 questions, 2 of them hinting at the experience of these agents, so kind of like the emotional part of minds. Can this one feel hungry, and can this one feel pleasant? And we also had 2 questions on their agency, whether this one can remember and whether this one can communicate, such as talking with someone. Afterwards, children engaged in a behavioral phase. So we had 3 tasks. In a normativity task, the child learned how to sort blocks according to their shape, and their partner learned to sort them according to color. In the test, we looked at whether they would show normative protest. To look at children's prosociality, we used an instrumental helping paradigm, so the child knew how to open a box containing a reward, and their partner failed to open it, so we looked at whether children would provide support. And we ran a classic Smarties false belief task to assess children's theory of mind. Okay, let's look at the mind description results first. In the upper panel, you see the 2 experience items. In the lower panel, you will see the 2 agency items. On the x-axis, you see the probability that children would ascribe certain mind properties. And what we see here is that across items and across domains, children understand that puppets have no or less minds than people. So there was clear support for the puppet as puppet hypothesis here. Children do ascribe less agency and less experience to puppets than to adults or peers. Let's look at their behaviors now. So once again, you have the 3 different tasks, and you have on the x-axis the probability that a child will show the key behavior. For normativity, we found little variation across conditions, with the null model and the puppet as adult hypothesis best predicting the data. We find a similar pattern also for children's prosociality. Once again, the null model and the puppet as adult model best predicting the data. And the same also applies to children's false belief understanding, the null model and the puppet as adult model best predicting the data. So in sum, based on these behavioral tasks, we say that there is little variation in children's social cognition across partners in the task designs that we used, and there is support for a null model or a puppet as adult model throughout. Okay, I think it is more important to note some constraints on generality here. This, of course, includes the social-cognitive phenomena that we studied, the proxies for those, the age ranges that we tested, the puppet types that we used, and I could go on this for hours. But for me, as a cross-cultural psychologist, the by far most important constraint to me relates to cultural context. So puppets are cultural artifacts, so is our attitude towards them. It's impossible to test children's social cognition with puppets in a cultural vacuum. So the children that we tested come from urban middle-class families in Germany. This is a context in which child development is typically studied, so it fitted well to our purpose here, but these children are global outliers on many cultural scales relevant to this research. So these children grow up with high levels of psychological autonomy. They grow up in largely egalitarian adult-child interactions. This might affect our data. We know for all of the social-cognitive phenomena that we studied that they vary cross-culturally. These children have particular high exposure to puppets, dolls, and other artifacts. And if you look, for example, at children's possessions in such contexts, and if you look at children's possessions in other contexts, you see that there's quite some variation in children's exposure to such artifacts. So I really want to emphasize that this is a validation of puppetry as it is used in developmental research. It's not a valid and a generalizable test of children's social cognition with puppets. And as a final note, I also want to emphasize another issue that I encountered when screening puppetry literature, which relates to ambiguity, probably at times also strategic ambiguity. So it feels like we as a field lack a clear and concise way of describing why, how, and what for we use puppets and such artifacts in our research. So most researchers neither state what kind of puppets they use at all, or why they use them, what for they use them. Some do, but at times it's quite vague. So people might talk about trying to mimic horizontal interactions, using puppets instead of peers, trying to reduce asymmetries, trying to reduce authorities, trying to establish egalitarian interactions, or having puppets acting as an equal, clumsy or childishly, or in a childlike manner. And I really think that to make sure that we can reproduce and falsify puppet research, we need less ambiguity here, we need more precision in how we introduce and describe those approaches. So we really must make our assumptions explicit when relying on puppetry. So to me, there's 2 different readings of the results overall. So there's an optimist in me who would emphasize that puppets do evoke realistic social cognition. It seems like they work. There's little variation across conditions for most of the task. Those who know me also know that I'm a scoffer. So children do understand that puppets are fake, on the other hand, and puppets are basically treated as adults by young children. So do we really expect children to behave differently to peers than to adults? If that's true, then puppetry might not be the ideal way to study children's social cognition with peers. And with this, I'm at the end of the talk. Thanks to my wonderful colleagues and the wonderful children who participated. Thank you.
We have time for questions. We'll start with one here in the front.
Hi, here. Thank you. Important work. Two questions. One, do you think there's a developmental story also on when you would find these effects? I mean, when puppets are taken as perhaps adults. And the second, I mean, you do find a difference between the over-imitation and the social cognition tasks, right? So what's your explanation for that?
Yeah, I'll probably start with the second question. So the over-imitation task was the only task where we found a difference across the adult and the child condition. And this is where puppets were different, but they were closer, much closer to adults than to peers. That's why I said on the last slide that if we really think that makes a difference, then we should be really skeptical what kind of method we use to mimic that. Or at least we should be open and transparent about it. As to the developmental trajectory, so in study, I mean, there's many differences across the two studies. One of them was live interactions. The other one was kind of this mock Skype call. The other one was also the different age ranges that we tested. I would say the way we use puppets here is typically in like early to middle childhood, so starting from like age 3 or so. And this is, I would say, already an age at which children understand that this puppet is not a real person. I don't know how it would be in younger children. I would have to dig a bit into the mind description literature, but my guess would be that around like 2.5 years of age or so, children are perfectly aware of this, which doesn't mean that they don't show realistic social behaviors, but yeah.
Another question in the back.
Thank you. This is a very cool study. Have you looked at the nature of the puppets? Recently, there are a few studies coming out showing that if you, for telling stories to kids, if the pictures are the animals, so anthropomorphized animals, versus you depicting real people in a storybook, kids actually learn better with the real people depicted in a story than anthropomorphized animals, let's say. And they are learn not as good when they perform prosocial behaviors. So from the anthropomorphized animals than humans. So I don't know whether you've done some studies or you're thinking about this.
No, not at all, but this is a really good point. So I think the majority of studies using puppets often use these like one-armed puppets, giraffes or lions or something like that. In most of the studies, it's not clear what kind of puppets is used. I used those puppets, and I wanted to show these puppets here because I think they're kind of like a gold standard in like looking childlike, but we might also tap into kind of like uncanny valley effects at some point. So we didn't do that, no, but that would definitely be interesting.
Another question here in the... We'll take the one in the front first and then the one in the back.
I know you said that you did this because of a review, but I was curious what your thoughts were regarding the fact that children didn't seem to ascribe mental states to puppets, but they treated them similarly to adults and children, who they ascribe more more mindedness to in all of these kind of mental state reasoning tasks.
Yeah. Well, first, I mean, if you look at the data, children, it's not that children did not ascribe minds to those agents, right? I mean, we're at about 0.5 probability that they will say yes. So they quite often said yes. So it's not nothing. It's just a clear effect compared to the other two conditions. But I think children can really zoom in as they are interacting, and then it doesn't make much of a difference, I think. So in the behavioral task, things are just, flowing. And in those tasks in the beginning, we just had showed them photos and they could really think things through and probably also felt like we're testing them, stuff like that. So I think the kind of like depth of the social interaction is definitely a thing that might drive this.
So also related to these ascriptions, one of the things that kind of was part of the framing of when people really started talking about this a couple of years ago was the role of pretense and the framing of the experiment as a whole in how children perceive these puppets. And I mean, I guess the first general question is, in the papers you've been looking at, is there any sort of explicit pretense framing about, like, are the kids told to pretend that the puppet is another child? And the follow-up question to that is, if not, why not? Right? Do you think that that would actually, do you think that if you gave a pretense framing that would explicitly move these ascriptions to be more childlike, that you would actually see something more like a puppet as peer result?
That's a good point. So we didn't, to do that in a clear way, then we would also have to have the adult saying that the adult is a child, right? To see if the adult can also efficiently simulate a peer. I think we didn't do that, not yet. And I would doubt that that would have strong effects on their behavior in, these other social cognition tasks 10 minutes after or so. No, yeah, sorry.
Okay, we're cutting into the break, so let's thank our final speaker and close the session.